Welcome to Journaling with Nature, the podcast for those who want to turn curiosity into wonder, a pencil sketch into a rabbit hole of discovery, a moment of stillness into a life full of joy. I'm your host, Bethan Burton. Let's open the pages of our nature journals and explore this world together. Hello, this is episode 137. Today's episode is a real treat for me because I'm interviewing a friend and because we're talking about one of my favourite things, and that is keeping a garden nature journal. I'm speaking with Brisbane-based garden consultant, author and edible weeds expert Kate Wall. During the conversation, you'll hear me ask some questions which were sent in by listeners of the show, and these questions were submitted via the platform Patreon. Now, Patreon is a place where listeners can pledge their support through a monthly donation, even as little as $1 per month. And in return, you get the knowledge that you're helping keep this podcast sustainable, and you'll also get the chance to have a little preview of upcoming guests and the chance to submit your own questions for them to be asked during my interviews. I want to say a big thank you to those people who have signed up to Patreon recently. I'm so happy to have you as part of the Patreon crew. And of course, thank you so much to those who have been supporting the show for a while now. Your contributions really do mean I can continue making this show, and I'm very grateful for that. So in this interview, Kate and I chat about creating healthy soil, the importance of having a diverse range of plants in your garden, how nature journaling and gardening can benefit each other, and the children's book that inspired Kate's magical wild garden. Let's listen. Kate, thank you so much for joining me. I am very, very excited about this one, to have the chance to chat with you about gardens and nature journaling.
Oh, thank you, Beth, and it's lovely to be here.
So, I would love to know, where did your love of gardening start? What's the origin story of your affinity with gardens and gardening?
That's a very difficult question to answer. I think it was probably born in me. I can't remember a time in my life ever that gardens weren't part of my life. So I tend to find that a lot of my early childhood memories are associated with plants and gardens and things like that. I created my first garden at 7, so I can say for sure I've been gardening since 7, and grew up in a family where everybody gardened in their own way, but it was around me. Interestingly, my siblings haven't picked up gardening, but it was very much a part of me, and everything revolved around having plants around me and gardens. And my favourite book as a child was a beautiful book called Lemonade Serenade, with these glorious drawings in it of this fantastic woman with these feathers in her hat in this wild garden with giant overgrown flowers. And to me, that was my absolute fantasy of what life should be. So while I don't have, huge ostrich feathers in my hat and big flowing skirts when I'm in the garden, that has always been what I've always wanted. That's the way I wanted to live my life, is this wild garden full of flowers.
Well, that's pretty funny because that's exactly what you have created for yourself. I've visited your garden and it is exactly like that. So it's amazing that that has come into life. And I have a question actually. As on the podcast now, I invite listeners of the show to propose questions. And I have a question from Linda, and Linda is a listener from San Diego County in California and loves to hear about plants in other parts of the world that support life. And Linda would like to hear about your patch, in fact, your garden, what you grow, and especially the emphasis on insect host plants and plants that grow and feed larvae for beneficial insects and invertebrates in the garden. So can you describe this amazing wonderland that you have created in your home patch?
One of the key things that I practice and I teach is diversity. It's not about saying this one plant is particularly good at attracting insects. Let's just create a huge diversity in the garden. There are always going to be plants that are better than others. So incorporating those great plants. I think when you were here, it was we had plenty of rain around and it was warm weather. So I had cosmos growing brilliantly, the yellow and orange cosmos. And of course, the insects love that. So that's a brilliant one for bringing the insects in. At the moment, it's too dry and they haven't come up again this year. I'm hoping we'll get some rain and that will change. But you can't rely on just one plant because things change in the garden all the time. Gardens aren't static. So this is where I think it's really, really important that you grow as big a diversity of different plants and flowering plants as possible. And why I do love incorporating weeds in my garden, because a lot of the weeds are very good pollinator plants, things like the cobbler's pegs, or even the good old-fashioned dandelions, or the cat's ears, the one that's often mistaken for dandelion. These are not just great food, but they're very good for pollinators and they flower well in the garden. And if you were to grow the cobbler's pegs with its pretty little white flowers with the yellow centre in the garden in amongst other things and let it flower, you would be amazed how many people don't realise it's there and that it's a weed. They just look at the effect of the flowers and then you've got all these wonderful insects. Then when it starts seeding, it doesn't look as nice. I give it a nice prune to get that flush of new growth and more flowers. So that one becomes not just a pretty plant in the garden, but very beneficial to the insects. The one thing that I will say though, about if you want insects in the garden, the thing you've got to watch and avoid are the hybridized plants that if you read the label, it's not a weed. So some of these plants have been bred to be sterile and they don't set seed. Those plants generally don't provide pollen or nectar. That's a big problem for the insects because not only are they not feeding the insects, but those insects, so if a bee is going around collecting pollen to take back to the hive, it actually has to feed along the way to have the energy to keep going from flower to flower and then get back to the hive. So if you take away that food source and the bee is visiting flower after flower that provides nothing, that bee is going to starve before it gets back to the hive. So really important, don't grow none of those if that's what you're really attracted to, but be aware that if these are new hybridized plants that don't set seed, they are not going to attract insects into the garden. Go back to some of those things that are heritage varieties potentially, or old-fashioned flowers is often the way to go, or weeds.
I love that you've touched on weeds because that's something I want to dive into with you. It's a speciality of yours, but I want to set a little picture of your garden as well, because I visited your garden and at that time, as you say, there was lots of rain. It was absolutely wild. It was like you open the front gate and you're in a tunnel almost of flowers. They were up to my eyes. They were flowing over. There was insects everywhere and just diversity, like you say, which was absolutely stunning. Color everywhere. There was something that struck me about your garden was there was little nooks, little places to sit, little places to see. And I'd love for you to describe that, about making these little spaces.
I think it's important to break up the space in a garden.
Yeah.
If you can take in the whole garden and see it in one view, you get bored very quickly. You look at it, you've seen it. It's where you can see that there's a bit more to it that you want to go and explore. That's what makes a garden interesting. So as a garden design tip, never allow the viewer of your garden to see the whole garden from one viewpoint. That is absolutely boring and it doesn't invite you into the garden. So this is where I think that a big part of it is to really make areas that you focus on in one area and then you move to another area and make a different focus in there. Whether they're connected or not is not necessarily the important thing. It's that you work in sections, and by doing that you're creating those rooms instead of trying to make one big sweeping garden that takes it all in one view. But of course, I am very attracted to those plants that get quite large and bold and have large flowers. For example, the salvias. I love salvias, but I can't grow the lovely, neat, small varieties because I'm so attracted to the large ones with their big, bold flowers that they overshadow all the small ones. So some of what you see in my garden is a bit of a haphazard throw it all together and I just can't resist some of these things that get bigger, which blocks your view. And that takes out some of the neatness. That's working with my personality, and I think it's really important you bring your own personality into the garden. So if you want a nice, neat garden, that's great, but you can still break up the view so that you can't take it all in one go. And different sections of the garden work really wonderfully that way.
Yes, and I read a quote from you, which is your garden should be an expression of you. And
Yes.
it sounds like, well, I know from experience of your garden and of you as a person and as a friend that this wildness, this love of...
I'm not a wild person, but I do love the wildness in my garden.
Yes.
That is very important to me.
Just this higgledy-piggledy mishmash of things, and in your garden you have things that are hanging, you
Yes.
have mirrors, you have mosaics and colour and texture and...
Well, I do have a very creative side, so I am a very
Yeah.
arty, crafty kind of person as
Yeah.
well, and it all comes together in the garden. I feel like the garden itself is an artwork. It's a living artwork that is constantly changing. Every day is different, and it's a pure joy. So I feel very creative when I'm in the garden, and I adore putting old stuff in the garden, putting chandeliers in the trees. But the other thing, when you comment on the hanging, of course I ran out of space. I only have a small garden, and well, you saw it was pretty full. There was not a lot of room to
Yes.
put new plants in. So the next thing was going up and hanging pots in the trees, tying things onto trees. I've got elk horns tied onto the posts of the house, wherever I can put a new plant in. So when you run out of space, you start looking for those sorts of excuses for having more plants.
And it was an entire feeling. Like, I remember going into your garden and just being like this upwelling of delight inside me. I was smiling. I couldn't stop smiling. You were up on your veranda, and I said, I'm just going to wander in the garden. And you said, sure thing. And I just wandered with this massive smile on my face. And tell me about the
It gives
feeling.
me a lot of joy to hear you say that, because for some people, coming into my garden is very challenging for them. It's, there definitely are people who don't like it, that it's
Okay.
too much, that they want the garden to stay back and be neat. And, well, that's okay. You don't have to enjoy my garden, because the only person who really has to enjoy my garden is me. And
Yeah.
I love my garden. So, and I really work with teaching people to create their dream garden, not mine or not somebody else's. It has to be
Yes.
what suits you. And for me, just that exuberance of colour and life and joy is really important to me. And that sense that I can just let it all happen instead of being constrained by what other people think. And I think that's what you're seeing, is that we are so restricted in life into trying to fit the mold of what everybody wants us to be. But my garden became my place where I didn't have to fit any mold, that I could let it be anything I wanted it to be. And there's where the joy came from, I think. And that sense of, I guess my inner child goes back to this beautiful book, Lemonade Serenade.
Yes.
And that's what I've created, and I love every day in my garden.
That is so delightful. The other thing that comes to mind is that it was a full sensory experience. There was different textures, there was different colors, there was different heights, there was different scents especially. I'd love to hear you speak about that, about creating a sensory experience, a multi-sensory experience.
Well, I certainly didn't set out to do that. It was pretty much, I love that plant, put it in the garden, and keep on. Yep, I'll put that one in, I'll put that one in, I'll put that one in, which is part of the haphazard nature of my garden, and probably a little bit of the haphazard nature of my personality, I suppose. But it's allowing myself to fall in love with plants individually and then put them together and make it work together. But part of loving a plant is you don't just love it because it's got fabulous flowers. You love it for so many different reasons. And so a sensory garden can happen very organically that way, that you will look at something and go, oh, look at that beautiful foliage, I want to grow that, or look at those amazing flowers, or you'll get the perfume. Or some of it happens accidentally, that you fell in love with the flowers. So, for example, the 4 o'clocks in my garden are like that I loved. When I first grew them, I took seeds from a plant hanging over a fence probably 30 years ago, and I was just so mesmerised by that glorious hot pink colour. and there were seeds on it. So I took a couple of seeds home, I grew them, and I've had it in my garden ever since. And then the added bonus of finding out that as those flowers open in the evening, the late afternoon, out comes this beautiful perfume. So
yes.
you just, some of this is a happy accident, but those happy accidents are far more likely to happen when you can just embrace loving plants instead of thinking about, will this go? Will this work in my design? Being a little bit more free with loving something for whatever it is offering in that moment can be enough, and then you get the added bonus. Whereas when you have overplanned something, it gets very hard to have happy accidents because everything is so controlled.
That's interesting. I'm wondering about the instinct to have a garden, because I feel it in myself. I see it all around me that as humans, we have this instinct. And I guess you can think back to evolution, where we needed to cultivate to survive. But it's more than that, because we love to create spaces that have this beauty. You know, we
Yes, we do. And I think that
internal.
is an internal thing, but we've also moved away from it so much. So we've seen our society where there's a disconnect to nature, which is where the nature journaling is so important. We see this giant disconnect. This is why I'm teaching people to garden, because they didn't grow up gardening. Yes. Their parents aren't gardeners. They haven't necessarily grown up with a garden around their house. And more we're seeing these houses that take up the entire property, and there's no room for a garden. Nobody wants a garden. We're seeing people put down fake turf instead of real grass. They're so moving away from nature, which is not healthy for them. And there are so many studies done that show the how close you live to trees impacts on your depression levels. The crime rates are lower in suburbs that have trees. That people's mental and physical well-being is related to how often they see living green plants. Even if that is a couple of indoor plants in the office, it can make a big difference, a scientifically recordable difference to people's well-being. So even though we're moving away from nature, that is not good for us. And I think that the more we reconnect back, the better it will be for our health and the welfare of our society at large. So it's not just about growing a garden for our own sake, even though we are growing our own dream garden and we're creating what is important to us. I think it's also important to realise that, well, one, from a nature point of view, the insects don't stop at the fence line and say, well, I'm not going next door.
Yes.
But it's for the people in our neighbourhood, it's really important that we're setting an example and showing them that gardening can be a wonderful thing. And this, I think, is really valuable. Even though I live in a very quiet little cul-de-sac, I do have people come past and talk about the garden. I've got a laneway next to me, and the people down the laneway will walk along and pick flowers that hang over my fence, and I encourage them to do that. And there's, little children down there who come and catch insects. They look for the grasshoppers along the side of the garden, everything hanging over the fence. They pick flowers, and I've told them, please pick any flowers hanging over the fence, because this is them learning to love nature. Interestingly, there is one professional couple down there who do not like anything hanging over the fence, and they will come and chop it all down.
Oh, dear.
Because their car beeps when it goes past.
Okay.
So, yeah, you still get those people that, are uncomfortable, but I think more and more it's important that we are showing people, giving them an opportunity, because otherwise, where are kids going to pick flowers these days? We all picked flowers on our way home from school as kids to take home to our parents. But where can kids do that now? So they're welcome to pick any flowers hanging over my fence when they walk past, because I think that's really important.
I love that. And I think it's important to say, while we're talking about your patch, that you don't have this great big space. You're in suburbia. You have a plot that's got an odd shape.
Triangular
as well.
Plot. Yep. Yep, it is an odd shape.
With planning and with passion, you can build something magnificent in suburbia, in a small space. I think that that's important to mention.
It is. I think that is really important, that you can certainly do it. But I also think it's important that you do it. And I have seen firsthand the damage of having development next door to me. I lost all my frogs. So that you see the results of that. I have lost a beehive because the neighbours were renovating and used timbers that were treated with resins that the bees brought home. So all of that does have an impact, but we shouldn't give up. We need to keep going. Nature needs us to keep going, and then talk to the neighbours and try and educate them gently, bit by bit. But one of my great delights was finding out that I had an echidna visiting the garden. And this is a fairly inner city suburb, surrounded by main roads. My garden's fully fenced. I've got dogs. And then to find that an echidna has visited was really exciting, to realise that wildlife does want places, and they are out there in our neighbourhoods looking for these places, so we should create them.
Yes, well, that makes me think of a speaker that was at the most recent Wild Wonder Nature Journaling Conference, and his name is Douglas Tallamy, and he's written a book called Nature's Best Hope, and he advocates for a grassroots approach to conservation, and that those of us who are lucky enough to have a garden space that we can cultivate, that we play a really important role in creating wildlife havens and corridors.
Absolutely,
and
we do, yes.
that will be crucial for the survival of lots of species. What do you think about that?
I think he's absolutely correct. It is very, very important. But the one thing I would say to that is a lot of people think that to do that they have to grow native plants. Oftentimes they're growing native plants that are not native to that local area, and that reduces the effectiveness of it. But I don't think we necessarily have to grow native plants, particularly here in Australia, where naturally Australia works on a boom-bust cycle. So often a lot of our natives come into a peak flowering season, and then they may not have a big flowering season for a number of years. That leaves our wildlife pretty stuck, especially when it's reduced into very reduced areas of natural habitat. So if we can sort of bolster that with anything that provides flowers or fruit year-round, so we're giving them a solid year-round diet to allow them to exist over a large area, and they will still prefer the natives wherever they can get it, and I absolutely love including natives in my garden, but I don't think we need to be fanatical about it. We can mix it all up, and we're still winning.
I love that. I love your approach to natives and other things, weeds. It's a very gentle, accepting approach, and I think that in gardens there can be this tendency to want or to work towards controlling everything, but your approach,
that's a really interesting point, because yes, there is a sense of control that is not the way I like to garden at all. And there's a real movement towards rewilding and these wildlife gardens. But which I think is very, very important, I've found that there's also a lot of gardeners, particularly the old style gardeners, who do still feel like if it's not controlled, it's not a garden. So, it does put you at odds with, various people in the industry. I've certainly experienced that. And I've seen people presenting on TV at very high levels and say, well, this is not a garden because there's a weed here and this hasn't been pruned. And I think if you want to keep things as a formal style of garden, that's entirely your choice. I really want everybody to garden in the way that makes them feel comfortable, because it's more important that you garden at all than to say, I'm not gardening because I don't like that style. So gardening full stop is the most important thing. But yeah, I do really love that, letting go of some of the control and letting plants show us what they want to achieve.
Yes.
Instead of being forced and constrained into what we want them to achieve.
Yes, and let's talk a little about weeds, because edible weeds and weeds in general is a speciality of yours.
Yes, it is.
I love that. And you talk a lot about how weeds have a lot to tell us. And when we can pay attention, we can listen to what the weeds are saying and use that to our advantage in the garden. Do you want to talk about that a little?
I think that's really, really important. We tend to just demonize weeds and say, all weeds are bad, and get rid of them. And so the first thing people do is reach for poison, what they're not thinking about. And well, actually, this goes back to all layers of gardening, is that people are looking at what happens above the ground where the most important thing is happening below the ground. So that's already out of sight. We need to start learning to see the garden differently, to use what we can see as symptomatic of what we can't see. Same with our bodies. We can't see inside of ourselves, but we know that's where the real business is happening. It's the same in the garden. It's the soil. But the weeds are really great because we didn't plant them, because they're growing, when people say a weed is a plant growing in the wrong place, it's not. It's growing in the right place, the exact right place for that plant, or it wouldn't have grown there.
Yes.
It's our garden plants that we put into the soil that we have and tell them, you grow here. The plants go, well, that's not what I want. This is not the soil I like growing in.
Yes.
So if we look at our weeds and we realise that they've chosen to grow in this space and this space suits them, then that can tell us a lot about that soil. When we, look it up and go, okay, this is a weed, for example, that has a deep taproot. I can't pull it out. It's too hard to pull out. It's got a deep taproot. That indicates that you've got a heavy compacted soil, that it's trying to open up this heavy soil that otherwise may be too difficult for other plants to get their roots through that soil. So we can learn a lot from the weeds by realising they've chosen to grow there. Most gardeners don't think about that when it comes to their plants, that we're putting them in spots that don't suit them a lot of the time. Take a bit more time to read a situation. And I think this is what I love about nature journaling is we're tuning in. Yes. I'm trying to teach gardeners to tune into their garden a little bit more and see what is going on. Learn from your garden before you try and manipulate it. If you have a garden full of weeds with deep taproots, you've got a pretty heavy soil that could be really hard work to garden in. So if you don't do something about fixing that soil before you try and grow a garden, you're set to fail.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, this is something that nature journalists practice every day, which is paying attention and noticing. I think of nature journalists as professional noticers of the world.
That's good.
And that's exactly what you're advocating in this idea of looking at weeds and saying, this weed's chosen this place to be. What can it tell me? What can I notice about it? And using that in the garden, I really think that matches so well with nature journaling.
I think so. And I think some of your listeners are probably thinking, well, hang on, the seed landed in my garden, that's why it grew. We should probably point out those seeds have landed in a lot of places, but they don't grow everywhere they land. And that's the difference is weeds tend to put out a huge number of seeds and spread them because this is naturally what they do. That's what they're very good at. But it's the ones that land in the right spot that are the ones that grow.
Yes. Let's talk a little more about ways that nature journaling and gardening can be helpful for each other. And we actually started our friendship and our collaboration because we saw that this pairing of gardening and nature journaling is so useful. You and I have done some journaling together. You've started documenting some of the plants that you regularly work with. Let's talk some more about nature journaling in the garden.
I think it's actually a fantastic way to pay attention, just like you said. And it's so through my books, my online courses, my presentations, I'm always trying to teach people that paying attention. Look around you. For example, learning about microclimates in the garden and where things will grow and trying to get people to learn about the microclimates in their garden. If that is a little difficult, it's a too big a concept, just nature journal different sections of the garden and you'll start seeing through that different plants are thriving in different places. And that immediately gives you a visual picture that the climate, the microclimate in those different sections must be different for those different plants to succeed in different parts of the garden. And this is where that paying attention can teach us so much about the conditions in the garden if only we pay attention. So nature journaling can be an alternative way of learning about your microclimates just through different parts of the garden. If you were to have a different journal for, say, 4 different areas of the garden, and then you go and compare them, you'll see things look quite different. And then if you think, well, why are these journals looking so different? They're 4 different journals from the same garden. you'll realise different sections of the garden can have completely different things happening, and it's connected to perhaps the different localised climates in those sections, or soil types even.
Yeah, there's so many different things that can match well. I'm thinking I've just recently taken your online course, and we'll talk more about that a bit later, but in it you talk a lot about pests and diseases, and I was thinking that nature journaling would be a wonderful way to document, the color of the leaves of an ailing plant, and then later on, if you apply some sort of fix to that or add something to the soil or whatever you might see, then redocumenting that, the leaves and the changes in color or patterning or whatever it is.
I cover pests and diseases in the course because this is what a lot of new gardeners are going to experience at some point. So trying to prepare them for what they're likely to find and what to do about that before things just blow out of control. But because I do a lot of garden consultations, I'm often confronted with people with a discoloured leaf on their plant saying, what's the problem? And people don't really know or understand. Of course, the more you pay attention, and of course nature journaling makes you pay attention, the more you're going to learn. But it's interesting that my approach to pests and diseases is not controlling them unless they're really out of hand. It's going back and fixing the soil.
Yes.
So even if you don't have a whole lot of pests and diseases, but maybe you draw your plants for the colours that they are, and then do it again a year later after you've done soil improvement, and then have a look. Are you seeing different colours in the leaves? Are the colours richer? Is the plant larger? Are the leaves larger? Are the leaves curled and now they're not curled? All those sorts of differences that could be through mineral deficiencies in the soil. It could be through insect attack, because insects will attack a weak plant before a healthy plant. And seeing the changes within a plant as you add compost and rock minerals and fix your soil, I think that is quite fascinating. And then if you are, of course, nature journaling, look at the insects that you see and include that if you can. And then over time have a look through again and see, did your early journals include a lot of insects that we would call pests? And over time, as your plant's health improved, did you notice that less of the insects were pests and more of them were pollinators? So these are some of the transitions towards a healthier garden that can be very subtle, and they can be hard to notice if you're not paying attention. And while a lot of people will go and take a photo, very rarely are they honing in on some of those sort of details, that those sort of details can tell us an enormous amount about what we've achieved in a garden.
Yes, I've got a couple of questions from listeners to the show who have questions about keeping a garden-based nature journal. Karina wants to know how to choose what to focus on in the nature journal without getting overwhelmed. And Jackie has a little message for you, and I'm going to read it out and then we can talk more about that. Jackie says, "Hi Kate, I only dabble in gardening. I mostly plant and keep up with my landscape plants rather than annual flowers and vegetables. I struggle with keeping a vegetable garden journal. I tend to include only momentous things like the day I plant something or when I harvest my first tomato, but not much in between." And Jackie's wondering about suggestions, and it matches well with Karina's question. What do we put in our journal, and how not to get overwhelmed? Because the garden is always full of things to look at and things to do. What do we put down? What's important to put down?
I think that's a really fascinating question, because the work that I've been doing at the moment with doing nature journaling around some of the weeds, you do then. I've done the same thing, is what do I keep in my drawing, what do I leave out of my drawing, so that it's telling me what I want to know. I think first and foremost, you've got to be attracted to something in the garden to want to draw it. And every day we feel differently, so it's good to do it at different times of the day or in different moods, because that will make us pick something completely different in the garden. If we do it at the same time every day, or if we are always going to wait until we are in a certain mood, we'll always be attracted to the same thing. We won't get as much variety. And then, so there's the attraction side of what you choose. Spend a little bit of time just looking and seeing, and let your drawing unfold a little bit. If you are just wanting to draw one flower, that's fine. If there's an insect on that flower, add it in if you feel like it, don't if you don't.
Yeah.
Maybe put a leaf. But if you think that's enough, then stop there. If you're feeling like, I actually am liking the combination of these two plants next to each other, then you might not try and draw the whole plants next to each other, but you draw the flower from one plant and the leaf, and then you draw the flower and leaf of the next plant together. So you can chop out little bits in that sense of what you're trying to put together. And then your journal shows, well, these two plants are actually in flower at the same time.
Yes, good point.
So that can be also quite interesting. You may even find that a week later one of those plants is no longer in flower but something else is. So it's still telling you a lot. So I understand that when there's a huge amount in front of you, it can be hard. So just sort of let your focus come in to one little thing. And if you're just sitting in the garden with a cuppa and you just happen to notice an insect crawling, what is it crawling on? What is it crawling towards? What are the little details around it? So it may be that you've got a little caterpillar that's on the ground, but you can see that it's heading towards a certain plant. It may be that you look at another plant and you see an interesting shaped hole in the leaf. And you wonder who did it. You turn it over, there's the culprit. Well, maybe there's no culprit and you just draw the leaf with the hole in it because that's what attracted your attention in that moment.
Yes.
But this is why it's important to stop in the garden and stop rushing and just let those moments unfold for you, and don't judge yourself. Because I think that's the other thing we all do, is we're so full of self-judgment.
Yes.
Going, this isn't good enough, that's not good enough, it's meant to be this, it's meant to be that. Throw all that out the window. And if it's just, today I am just in a mood, all I want to do is draw a rock because that's all I feel.
Yeah.
Fine, that's okay. That's still telling you something. I'm not sure what the rock tells you, but maybe you've got too many rocks in the garden or not enough rocks in the garden. I don't know. But the importance is that it comes down to those details. But if you then suddenly go, look, I'm just in love with the whole picture today, then maybe you focus on some of the broader shapes in the garden with moments of colour rather than trying to get everything into specifics. So, some big waves of green perhaps and some waves of colour. That's okay too.
That tells a lot, especially
yeah.
about differences in climate, what's happening at the moment here in Brisbane. We're experiencing such a dry patch, and I just look around and everything is yellow and dry.
Yeah, your journal's going to look very different to what it did a year ago,
Yeah, and I really love what you said about just being there and sitting and watching and waiting and letting the story unfold and putting that in your journal. Oh, there's that little creature. Oh, there's this visitor to the garden or whatever it is, and letting your interest and your attention just wander. It's almost like stream of consciousness noticing, you just
It really is. But it's, these days too, we're all trying to learn mindfulness. It's the buzzword, isn't it?
Yeah.
And yet this is what gardeners do. You're so in the garden that everything else just leaves your head, not deliberately. I never garden with headphones on. I'm never listening to anything. I'm just completely absorbed in what I'm doing. And it's not deliberate. I'm not trying to. It's, I just am so in love with my garden, I suppose. But, I find this, in whatever garden I'm in, is I just get so drawn into the plants and the soil and what's happening that fills my head. There's not room for anything else.
Yeah, beautiful.
So, hang on, do we want to go back to what Jackie was saying about the veggie patch?
Yes, go ahead.
So, you don't have to be focused on everything all the time. When you've got a garden with a lot of different plants in, you're not going to draw every single one of them all the time. So again, this comes into that forgive yourself. I did a count in my garden a couple of months ago because I wanted to prove that autumn is peak flowering season in the subtropics.
Interesting.
And spring we get the big showy stuff, but there's actually more in flower in autumn.
I agree.
And
yes.
So I did my spring count to compare to my autumn count. And I had 95 different plants in flower.
Oh.
Not different individuals, different types of plants in flower.
Wow.
So, they're not all big and showy. Some of them are tiny. But the insects don't differentiate between big and showy. That's not what attracts them necessarily. So you can't fit everything in. You're picking the bits and pieces out of it anyway. So don't try. Within that, of course, you have your landscaping staples that form the structure of the garden. And some of the comings and goings in between that can be the annuals. I personally don't grow a lot of flowering annuals because there's just so much work involved in replacing them constantly. But this is where some of the weeds do that for you because they can be so pretty and some of them are annuals, so that works perfectly. So while I'm not a huge fan of annuals, they do have a role if you want them to. If you don't, well, there's plenty of other things to grow. It doesn't have to be that. And when it comes to the veggie patch, unfortunately, a proper veggie patch does need a lot of attention. So if you're not giving it the attention, it's not going to succeed. Therefore, perhaps if you're not there to do nature journaling in the veggie patch, is that telling you you're not giving your veggie patch enough attention? Maybe you need to step away from growing annual vegetables and grow perennial vegetables, which don't need it quite as much care. So there's a lot of different ways of looking at it, and none of it's right or wrong.
Yes, that's a really good point. I think perennial vegetables are a underutilized savior for someone who's time poor.
Very much, especially in our climate. If you're in a cold climate that has very cold winters potentially, which of course a lot of the world does have, it's very hard to grow through winter. And for us here in the subtropics, well, it's very hard to imagine that you would have any time of the year you can't grow something.
Yes.
But so that kind of forces you to grow a lot more annuals, particularly when it comes to vegetables. But for us, where we grow 12 months of the year, perennial edibles are absolutely the way to go. Much, much easier. It's all I grow.
I wouldn't say I'm a beginner gardener. I've been loving gardens and using gardens for forever, but I feel like I have no particular knowledge or expertise. But one thing that through all this learning over the years, the thing that's essential, the thing that underpins absolutely everything is the soil. And
it absolutely does, yes.
You talk all about soil and the importance of just building a soil before you even think about putting your plants in. I'd love for you to talk about soil and why it's so important for success in the garden.
Well, soil I think is important for life on this planet, but
yes.
It's so one of these things we take for granted, and we have been taking for granted for far too long. Soil science is now becoming a massive area of growth. Unfortunately, a lot of damage has been done to our soil because we haven't thought about how important our soil is. But the truth of it is, plants' roots are in the ground. This is where they're feeding. This is where all the magic happens. So what is going on in the ground really is going to determine what happens above the ground. It's you can spray foliar feeds over the top of the plant. It's only ever going to be a short-term Band-Aid solution. If we really want a healthy planet, it's got to be via the soil. And of course, soil is all about life, as we're starting to really grasp. The life in the soil is critical for life on this planet because it's critical for plants to grow. And the more chemicals we put onto our soil, the more we harm life in the soil. And my second book, Earth Repair Gardening, really goes into the soil quite a fair bit and helping people to understand that soil is not just important to get a strong, healthy plant to grow, but that relationship between a plant and the microorganisms in the soil is a key driver of taking carbon out of our atmosphere and storing it into the soil and creating a carbon sink. Whether we're doing that on the scale of a forest or in our own backyard, every single person can garden in such a way that we are turning our gardens into a carbon sink, and this is something I'm very passionate about. But this is all about putting the goodness back in the soil. So we need to add organic matter to the soil through composting. Even if we're not doing huge amounts of composting, every little bit helps. Organic mulches will compost naturally over time into the soil. Everything that we can do to build a healthier soil that has more life in it is giving life back to the planet.
And when you say life, we're talking about a whole host of different things, including invertebrates, microbes, fungi, bacteria, viruses. There's just so much
more than we
diversity.
can name.
Yes.
You know, we see worms, and worms are a really good indicator. So if you've got a lot of worms in your soil, you'll have heaps of other things as well that you can't see. If you've got no worms, you probably haven't got much of anything else as well. So the worms are a very good indicator. But if you were to lift off your mulch layer and look closely, this is what we call the humus layer, the bit where the organic mulch touches the soil. That's where all the action happens and it's starting to break down. If you sit and look closely at that area, you'll see all sorts of tiny little things moving, which could be a really good exercise for nature journaling.
Yes, absolutely.
To have a look at how your mulch looks different where it touches the soil than it does on the top, and what's happening there, who lives there. But the reality is the vast majority of the life that we rely on in the soil to create a healthy soil and to make plants grow well is completely invisible to us. It's microscopic. If you see fungi popping up, you know, we sometimes see these amazing fruiting bodies, the stinkhorn fungi and those sorts of crazy things. They're just the fruiting body. That is an indicator that you've got this wonderful network happening in the soil. And it's those, most of the time invisible, systems of hyphae or mycelium, of the threads of fungi, which is like a root system but not technically a root system. Threads all the way through the soil. This becomes this incredible network through the soil that's completely invisible to us most of the time, but this network connects plants to each other. It allows plants to communicate with each other, share resources with each other. This world is mind-blowing. We're only just starting to understand that it even exists. But the second you pour chemicals onto the soil, you're destroying it.
Yes. I did a permaculture design certificate some years back, and I was in that class with a Brazilian friend who I met there, and she summarized the entire course when she said, so I understand everything now. And her summary of the entire permaculture course was, add organic matter.
Yep.
And you have the same mantra. You say, if in doubt, add compost.
That is my mantra. Yes, that is exactly right. Yes, if you have a problem above ground and you're not sure what it is or how to fix it, add compost. Because you're going to fix your soil, you're going to strengthen your plant. Your plant will naturally be able to fight off. I mean, just think about it like us. If we get a cold or we're getting sick all the time, it's a real sign that our bodies are run down. We're far less likely to come down with everything if we are healthy. We all know this, that we've worked too much, we haven't paid attention to our diet, we're likely to get sick. We all know that. It's exactly the same in our gardens, that plants that are constantly getting sick or not thriving or getting attacked, there's a weakness, an inherent weakness there that we need to address, and that comes back to the soil. Give them a good dose of compost.
And compost is beautiful in that it fixes compacted soil, it fixes clay soil.
Oh, look, any sort of soil that you're dealing with, at the end of the day, we need to add the organic matter. So organic matter is really important in all soil types. And so what I do love about that is that the strategy for fixing a waterlogged soil or a drought-affected soil is actually the same. That we're trying to come back to that middle place. For if you're preparing for flooding or waterlogging, or you're preparing for drought, you can do exactly the same thing. We want to add lots and lots of organic matter into the soil so that it can act like a sponge in the soil and buffers the extreme conditions.
Yeah. Soil is just so amazing. And I've noticed with my garden, when I take the time to prepare the bed and get the soil right, you don't really go wrong with your plantings, because they just flourish in that way. And I think that I often focus on creating and putting out nature journal prompts, and I think one of them needs to be now nature journaling the soil and the life in the soil, because it's such an exciting area.
It really is. And there's a lot that's invisible.
Yes,
so we're only
true.
going to see a tiny amount. But this is where you have always been a little bit interested in the decay side, that, a curled up dying leaf is still interesting. Yes. Well, when you think that through, this is something that's giving back now.
Yes.
It's, as anything is decaying, it is giving back. And that's a valuable concept.
Absolutely.
So don't rake up all of the old leaves. Don't try and have a garden that's too tidy, because there's no composting happening there.
Yes. As nature journalists, we often use the tool of map making to learn about our landscape. And as a garden educator, I know you propose that people make a map of their gardens to observe the movement of sun and wind and water through the space and across the seasons as well, to understand the system and what and where to plant things.
Yeah, I tend to recommend you do that initially rather than on an ongoing basis so much, because I think if we do have a plan we tend to feel that we're constrained by it. It doesn't give us freedom. So I do encourage rough maps. I don't like them when they're too polished, because the more polished they are, the more they restrain us to fit into that model. So I like them to stay quite fluid. Yes, it is a really useful way of putting, here's where the tree needs to go. This is where the shade is. This is where the sun is at different times of the year. Learn, but then let it be fluid and let it adjust, so that we're not constrained in the garden. We're learning to give us more freedom to make those changes rather than trying to fit within what's already there.
I really like that. I really like your approach of fluidity and flexibility, and just watching and learning from the garden, because the garden has so much to teach us, and the nature journal can be a tool for that, to facilitate that learning. But what we as gardeners and journalists have to do is just pay attention.
We really do. A story comes to mind when you say that I've always tried to teach people that you need to get your trees in the right place before you plant them, because you can't dig them up and move them. Trees have got to go where they've got to go. But most other plants in the garden can be dug up and moved if the position is wrong or over time things change. So I do encourage you to put a huge effort into choosing the right tree and getting it in the right spot. With some of the rest of it, that fluidity really does come in. I had one client who I was working with who just took that so far that she kept on digging everything up and moving it. And I had to say to her, can you please just let it be for a little while? Let this poor plant grow somewhere before you dig it up and move it yet again. So fluidity is great, but do give things a breather.
So we talked about weeds, and edible weeds is a really big passion of yours. I have been on
I love them.
A course with you, a class where we wandered around and we discussed all the weeds, and it was amazing, in fact, to see. You can look over a landscape and just find this literal feast of weeds there.
You can, and in so many different landscapes. And I love that. We talk about the difficulty of growing vegetables, and yet the weeds are doing it all by themselves.
Yes,
Isn't that fantastic?
They're super nutritious, right?
They are very, well, no, there are definitely ones amongst them that aren't really great. Doesn't mean every weed is, but amongst the weeds, there are some powerhouse foods.
Yes.
Absolute powerhouses. And we forget that our vegetables have been bred and bred and bred over centuries to be what we want them to be. And in particular, they've been bred to be sweeter and sweeter and sweeter. We probably wouldn't recognise even the same vegetables 100 years ago. The flavour would be so different. Think about it like this. As kids, we used to eat watermelon that had seeds in it.
Yes.
It's very hard to find watermelon with seeds in these days. We used to eat corn. Now it's only sweet corn. even within a generation, we've seen huge changes. And this is not through genetic modification. This is through selective breeding. But this has been going on for a very long time. The original watermelons had a lot more seeds even than what we were familiar with, and a lot less flesh. So as this happens, to make it a plant more what we want and less of what we don't want, we end up losing some of the nutritional value at every turn, particularly when we're adjusting the flavour of anything and making it sweeter. Because it's those bitter components, those stronger flavours where the nutrition lies. So if we're taking that out to make a plant sweeter and have a higher component of sugar in the plant, we've reduced the nutritional value of it. Even if it's grown organically in fabulous soil, that plant just isn't capable of holding the nutrition that a lot of the weeds can, because they have not been bred for that. They're still in a very pure, wild form. However, a lot of people find that when they do turn to eating weeds the first time, they can't do it because it's so bitter. And it amazes me now when people eat these and they're spitting them out and go, oh, yuck, it's bitter. But for me, I don't taste the bitterness, and it's all about our palates adjusting to what we're used to.
Is it true that the bitterness triggers digestion, that bitter flavour? Okay.
Yes. I mean, bitterness can also be an indication that it's poisonous. So we do need to take a little bit of care there. Things that are poisonous, mostly, not always, will have a nasty flavour to them. It's a warning sign. The plant doesn't want you to eat the whole plant. It wants you to leave it alone. So it warns you that it's going to kill you. We need to tune into that. But yes, things that are somewhat bitter in their flavouring will definitely get the stomach juices going and help increase the ability to digest your food. And if we don't include bitter, we are really slowing down the way our systems work. So yeah, bitter flavours are really important to include in our diets because it does stimulate the production of bile and the stomach acids to digest your food.
Yes. I have a question, and it relates to what you just said, and it's from Jackie again. Jackie says, when I'm outdoors, I want to use my sense of taste. How can I safely taste growing things around me? And this is a really hard one to answer, I'm sure. Jackie says, can I safely taste a teensy-weensy bit of something unknown? If I put it on my tongue but I don't chew or swallow, is it generally safe, or is this a bad idea?
There are some things out there, I'm thinking radium weed, for example, that is a euphorbia. If you were to take a piece of euphorbia with that milky sap and put that on your tongue's going to burn. So it will stop you poisoning yourself, but you're going to be incredibly uncomfortable. So I wouldn't recommend if you're a complete novice. I do think you need to learn a little bit and look for some of the signs. One of the things to start with is smell. If something smells nasty, it's probably not good to eat it. If something smells fantastic, maybe. But actually, no, there's some, I'm thinking of there's some incredibly toxic plants out there. And one of the things I do try and teach, because I love the fact that plants provide the most powerful medicines. Plant medicine is a fascinating area to me. And I do try and teach people to use their weeds medicinally, even their garden plants. A lot of people don't realise that the common old garden geranium is a brilliant medicinal plant. But it's, yes, we do have some plants that are able to kill you quite quickly in very low doses. And that doesn't mean they're not medicinal. So, for example, the periwinkles, the vincas, there is another weed here, but it's grown all around the world with the large pink flowers. It's a really hardy plant. They've made some fantastic anti-cancer medications from it. It's a great plant. But it will lower your blood pressure so fast that it can kill you. So nibbling on that could be a one-way trip. So do be careful, very, very careful. No, I don't encourage you to just go chewing on things. Respect the fact that plants have this incredible power to either nourish us in a really powerful way or kill us very quickly.
Finding out before we taste something is important. And in fact, this was where you and I linked up first, because we had this idea that nature journaling can help us identify safely and get to know and understand the differences between edible weeds and weeds that are inedible. So this is another way that nature journaling can be super useful.
Yeah, because I think it really does. And as we talked about, it brings you into the detail of the plant. That really helps you learn to identify the plant, so that when you're out and about somewhere else, you can quickly and easily identify a plant and know exactly what it is that one's safe to eat. Or you see that some of those tiny details, because, some of these plants, well, I've had this difficulty in my project that I'm working on in drawing a lot of the different weeds is, small green leaves, little white flowers.
Yeah.
It can be pretty hard to work out what's what and draw a picture that looks like something different to the next one. It was one hell of a challenge that I'm not to the other side of yet, of how to draw plants with small green leaves and small white flowers and identify them as different plants, because
and
I'm used to seeing them. I can easily recognize the differences, but to be able to draw those differences becomes challenging. But it does make you start seeing the plant in detail that you've never looked at before, which has actually been quite a wonderful learning experience.
And again, that's about noticing and getting down, spending time, getting out the magnifying glass if it's a very small plant, and just paying attention. And even one amazing nature journaling method is comparison. So you might, if you have two similar plants, you might document them side by side on a nature journal page and see.
Yes, chickweed is your classic case.
Yeah.
Chickweed with those small green leaves, those little white star-shaped flowers. Powerhouse plant. We should all be eating bucket loads of it. But of course there are a number of toxic lookalikes. So nature journaling is perfect for tuning into those tiny differences between plants, so you know exactly which one's which.
Yes. So advice could be, if you're in Brisbane, come along to one of Kate's many in-person weed walks, and I'm sure that there are weed walks
wherever you are in the world. It's really is becoming a big thing. So I do encourage people, if you want to learn about weeds, foraging weeds, eating weeds, there are some wonderful books, including my own, of course, that are written in different parts of the world that give you different information, but you should always do a local course. Go and identify things locally. And this is why I have been asked, and I won't do an online foraging course, because misidentification, particularly if you're not in my location, you may have something else growing there that looks similar, but it's not the same thing. You will have different weeds in different places. Yes, there's a lot of the key weeds are cosmopolitan. Chickweed, you're going to find it all over the world. But you will also have local things that are very specific to your climate, your local area. Great to go and get to know them locally.
Yes, great advice. So you have just released this online course. I've taken the course. I love it. It's called Get Started Gardening. I'd love for you to talk more about your course and how people can get involved, because it's online. Everyone from all around the world can get involved.
They sure can. So this, as with a lot of the things I do, has come out of the fact that I do a lot of garden consultations. So I'm in private gardens, often teaching people one-on-one how to garden. And through doing that, I see them make a lot of mistakes. I see them ask questions that are often the wrong questions, but they don't know that they're the wrong questions. And this is why, so then I take them back and say, actually, we need to start with the soil. We need to start by understanding the conditions you're gardening in. And that's why I've put it together in a course like this, to give people the real basics that we assume as professional horticulturalists that everybody's got those basics, but they don't.
Yes.
It's not necessarily out there anymore. Or everything that I learned as a small child in a family of gardeners, they haven't learnt. They haven't grown up knowing these things. So this is why I thought, I'm going to go back to the very beginning. There's lots of different things out there for different specialties, but there's not a lot that's there for the very beginning and working out, where do you start? What have you got to get first? How do you know what sort of soil you've got? And once you know, what do you do next? So that's where I've put all of that in. And while I can't necessarily say grow this plant next to this plant, because yes, it does suit everybody wherever you are in the world. What I've tried to do is help you understand how you choose plants and where you put them together so that you're empowered to make those choices, because you can go down to, Bunnings for us, but wherever you are in the world, there's a version of that, and spend a couple $100 in a weekend, go home and find you've got a box of plants that's actually not a huge amount of plants and a few bags of stuff, and put it all together in the garden and then stand back and go, well, that's very disappointing.
Yeah.
That's what I don't want people to do. Gardening mistakes can take a lot of money and put people off very quickly.
Yes.
And if you're put off, you're not going to continue being a gardener. That's not good for our planet. Our planet needs us all to be happy gardening people. So I want people to have success in their garden without it being too expensive or unmanageable, too much work even. Because again, let's face it, people say to me all the time, I watch them on TV and you have to do this and then you do this and then you do this. I tried all that and it didn't work and it cost me a fortune. It was so complicated. So I try and bring everything back, make it nice and simple so you understand why you're doing it. I think that's important. We're far more likely to do something and do it well if we understand why we're doing it, and then why you don't have to do all of this other extra complicated stuff. So I've put it all together in a course. It's sort of broken into sections so you can do it a bit at a time. And the bit you need to do first, get out and do some gardening, put it into practice, come back into the course and ask some questions as you go. So you've got a couple of years access so you can come in and out, check up again after things have grown for a bit, ask a question down the track. It doesn't all have to happen at once, because gardening doesn't happen all at once.
Yes. It's unfolding. And I love that you have the ability within the course to ask you a question that you will be there to answer directly, which about specifics in your garden or how does this relate to that. And I love that interactive section.
Oh, good. I'm glad you're enjoying that. I think it's really important that it's not about me just lecturing to you, but you get the chance. You're going to learn better if you ask questions. And the ultimate game is to turn you into a gardener.
Yes, that's the beautiful thing about it. I'm going to leave links to your course and your website and all the ways that people can find you online in the show notes for this podcast. Kate, thank you so much for joining me. It's been absolutely delightful to learn from you and to talk to you about nature journaling and gardening.
Bethan, it's been my absolute pleasure. And can I just say, it has also been my great pleasure to have you in my life teaching me about nature journaling, because I am learning all the time as well. And, these plants that I know inside out, now that I'm drawing them, I'm seeing new details. And I think it's wonderful. So it's really a two-way street. Thank you so much, Bethan.
That's beautiful. Here's to many, many more future collaborations.
Absolutely.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Kate. I strongly believe that nature journaling and gardening are a perfect match, and this is an area that I want to focus more time and attention on in my own nature journaling practice. I love Kate's method of gardening without constraints, with freedom to explore, change, and grow with nature. And this idea that we can be active conservationists just by creating a diverse, wildlife-friendly garden. I found this conversation so inspiring, and I hope you did too. If you'd like to have a peek at Kate's wild wonderland of a garden, I've included some photographs that I took when I visited her there, and I've put them up on the Journaling with Nature website where this podcast episode lives. Feel free to go over there and leave a comment about your experience with nature journaling and gardening. Thank you so much for listening. See you next week.